Hello everyone. Today Maria, Mariana, Sheida and I, Marta, are going to continue the discussion about the tragedy of the commons, and in particular we are going to address the external validity of the lab experiments. So, for a long time, economic theory assumed that individuals behave only according to self-interest. However, we know that people care about others' outcomes in addition to their own outcomes, and this is known as social preferences. Some examples of social behavior are altruism, reciprocity, trust, or inequality aversion. From the 80s, researchers have attempted to analyze to what extent people behave contrary to this material self-interest, and this research into social preferences has been conducted mainly in experimental and behavioral economics. Lab and field experiments complement to each other, and there are several reasons why we would like to conduct a lab experiment before moving to the field. For instance, because we can have a controlled environment and we can isolate the causal relationship that we want to analyze. Also, it's easy to reproduce the conditions of the theoretical models and it's easy to replicate past findings. Also, lab experiments provide insights for behavioral patterns before moving to the field, which is usually more complicated and more expensive to conduct. However, it's really important to address the external validity of these games because there is a risk that social preference research becomes research of how people play certain games instead of explaining how people behave in social situations. So this is the outline of today's presentation. First of all, we're gonna discuss a paper by Galizzi and Navarro Martinez that you all read. And in particular, in this paper, they attempt to analyze to what extent the predictions of the experimental social preference games hold when put in context or outside the lab. And they study some social behaviors such as altruism, trust, positive reciprocity, and cooperative behavior. They conduct a 3-day experiment in order to see if the behavior from games and past behavior is the same in the field. And they use the same pool of individuals. Maria and I will discuss this paper and the results. Then, we're gonna move to a second paper from our Professor and some colleagues, in which they study the cooperation among fishermen. In particular, in this paper, they conduct research into cooperative behavior, which is essential to overcome the tragedy of the commons. As you may know, the tragedy of the commons is a situation in which goods are rival and property rights are not well defined and cannot be enforced. The tragedy of the commons has been commonly applied to fishing because there is a risk of overuse. In this paper, they implement a version of the voluntary contribution mechanism game by creating a social dilemma that Sheida is going to explain to you. And they compare this situation with the situation in which only private incentives are present. And they want to examine if the evidence from game theory holds, which suggests that individuals cooperate, but the level of cooperation declines as the game is repeated. They conduct a field experiment with fishermen, but also several lab experiments with different pool of subjects, such as fishermen and students in different locations. One difference that we noticed with respect to Galizzi et al. Is that the subjects participating in each activity are not exactly the same. Finally, Mariana is going to discuss the conclusions. Now Maria is going to present the first paper.
Thank you, Marta. Now I'm going to present you the methodology followed in this paper. There were 363 participants who were part of sessions that included a set of questions about social behaviors in the past, a set of social preference games that were played in the lab, and several situations related to social preferences that were created outside the lab. These sessions took place during 3 different days in the same week, and they were thought to minimize the possibility of cross-contamination between the different tasks. At the end of the 3rd day session, people were paid £30 for their participation and some extra payment according to their performance in the games. Considering this, the main objective of the design was to evaluate, using the same sample of people, the social preference games against the actual social behavior in the field and against the self-reported social behaviors from the past. Okay, so during day 1, all participants were gathered in the lab to first perform tasks that could be unrelated to social preferences. Then they filled a questionnaire with 20 items that asked them how often did they do some actions related to prosocial behavior. These items could be answered in a scale from 1, which means never, to 5, which stands for very often. The next day, all participants were again in the lab, but this time they played 7 different games that are commonly used in economics to measure social preferences. These games were independent and one-shot, which means that participants only played them once. This was done to reduce the effects of learning, feedback, income, and reputation on the decision-making of the participants, and also because the setup makes the games more similar to the one-shot field situation they face at the end of the 3rd day. In each of the 7 games, all participants were matched randomly and anonymously with other participants, and these matches were different every time. At the end of the 3rd day, one of the 7 games was randomly selected and paid to participants. So the first game is Dictator Game. This game has 2 players and has 2 versions. In the first version, player 1 has an initial endowment of £10 and decides to divide them between him or her and player 2. Player 2 simply receives the allocation established by player 1. The second version is the same as the Dictator Game 1, but then the roles of all players are switched and people are matched with different partners. The second game is the Ultimatum Game. This game has also 2 players and 2 versions. During the first one, player 1 decides how to divide £10 between him or her and player 2. Player 2 decides whether to accept the allocation or not. If the allocation is rejected, both players get nothing. The second ultimatum game is played as the first, but all the participants were player 2 and had to respond to the same allocation of £3 that was made by a participant who was player 1 in a preliminary pilot session. To determine the payoff, one participant of this session was randomly selected and matched to the pilot version player 1. The third game is the Trust Game. This game has 2 players and 2 versions. In the first one, player 1 has an endowment of £10 and decides how much of it to send to player 2. The amount sent is then multiplied by 3 and given to player 2, who decides how much of it to send back to player 1. In the second version, the game is played as the first, but all participants were player 2 and had to respond to the same amount of £4. The way this allocation is made and the payoffs decided is the same as in the last game, Ultimatum Game 2. Finally, the last game was a public good game with 4 players. Each one of them had £10 as an endowment and decided at the same time how much of it to contribute to a common group fund. The money in it is then multiplied by 2 and split between the 4 players. With this game, the day 2 finishes. In day 3, all participants worked on a task that was unrelated to social preferences, and then, out of the lab, they had the opportunity to behave prosocially in 1 out of 5 situations. It is important to notice that the money gained in the previous experiment was endowment for the field situation, and that the location of this field was a natural place for students. So there was no apparent reason to think that the situations they faced were related with the lab experiment. Here we can see the 5 situations that students could find outside the lab. Boxes and fun situation involve helping others, and children's charity, environmental charity, and lab donations involve donating money, which are representative of situations in real life related to social preferences. The 5 situations were run consecutively and in the order shown here. The authors make a relationship between some of the situations and the games in order to measure some social preference constructs. For instance, altruism is captured in the Dictator game if player 1 makes contributions above 0. Altruism is also captured in the box, fun, and children's charity situations, when there is no elements of a strategic interaction or reciprocity involved. Positive reciprocity could be seen in the trust game if player 1 or player 2 make contributions above 0, and it is likely to be part of the lab donation situation because participants have just received money from the lab. With regards to cooperation, if players of the public good game contribute, such contribution can be interpreted as cooperative behavior. Cooperation is also likely to be a relevant reason in the environmental charity situation, because it focuses essentially on a contribution to a public good. Finally, all games are related to inequality aversion, because the decision made by every player affects the payoffs of the others, and it is related with all the field situations, but mostly with the children's charity one. In this point, we would like to ask you a question. Do you think there is a negative reciprocity in any game or situation? If so, in which one? You can pause the video and think about it if you want. Now Marta is going to take over the presentation and is going to explain to you the results of this study.
Regarding the field situations, also here you have a table that summarizes the main results. And you can see how many people helped the research assistant to carry the boxes, also how many people lent him or her the phone, also how many people gave a positive amount to the children charity, and also to the environmental charity, and finally to the lab. So the most interesting part of the results is to compare the behavior that we observe in the games with respect to the other two situations. And first we're going to start with the past behavior. Here we have the correlation between the variables, and we see that there's only a weak relationship between the past behavior and the social preferring game results. Also, if we see the regression analysis, we see there's only one variable that is statistically significant at a 5% level. So the conclusion is that the games have very limited power to explain the past behavior. Next, we have the results of how the games compare with the field behavior. And here we have the correlation matrix, and again there's only one significant correlation at a 5% level, which is likely to be spurious. So here the conclusion is that there is no systematic relationship between the game decision and the behaviors in the field situations. Also, the correlation that they found is a 0.03, which is much lower than the correlation that they found in the meta-analysis of the previous literature, which is a 0.27. Also, if we look at the regression analysis, we reach the same conclusion, which is that the games have very limited power to explain the field behavior. Since there are only 2 coefficients out of 56, they are statistically significant at a 5% level.
Hello everyone, I'm going to present you the paper which is from lab to field cooperation among fishermen. The paper mentions 2 sets of the experiments, and the first experiment is conducted here in the place that you see in the picture. It is Dabice Overs, it is very close to Tilburg, and people go there to catch fish. We will test the cooperation level among fishermen. I will mention about 3 different experiments in the first set. These are field VCM, field PI, and field SERE. Here, as you see, field VCM stands for the field voluntary contribution mechanism. Field PI is the field private incentive, and field screening is the field SERE. And the organization of the experiment is as follows. There are 4 people in each experiment, and there are 6 rounds, and each round takes 4 hours. And fishermen in this experiment, they can catch maximum 2 fishes in each round. So let's see for the 5 VCM. So they ask 2 choices. In the first one, fishermen can catch the fish and they own them. And in the second choice, they sacrifice the fish, either 1 or 2. So what happens when they sacrifice the fish? If you sacrifice 1 fish, the money of the fish, which is worth the 6 euros, will be divided into other 3 members, 2 of each. And for the 5 PI, there is no externality like that. You can catch the fish and you just own it, and the value that you sacrificed will not be given to others. Thirdly, I will explain filed SER. Here we are sure that social dilemma exists, and social dilemma exists if participants value the right to catch one additional unit less than 6 euros. They offer 2 options, and in the first of them, they catch 2 fish per session, which lasts 4 hours, as I explained. And in the second option, they took a 72 euros with remaining in the fishing site but without fishing. So there were 46 fishermen in this experiment, and 30 of them chose 72 euros. And they took those 16 people for VCM experiment, and they named the experiment as VCM SCR. Also, note here is that rounds conducted in 2008 in June, September, and October, and also May 2012. Depending on the weather condition, experiment name change actually. Low means in June and high means in September and October. Because in September and October the condition is better and they can catch fish better. So what do we measure here? As I said in the very beginning, it is collaboration. So what is the definition of the collaboration again? The first definition, sacrificing 1 fish in return of 6 euros to members of the group. And the secondly, number of the times an average fisherman cast his fishing rod per minute. So if you put your effort to catch 1 fish, means that you collaborate less. If you sacrifice more, means that you collaborate more. So I will ask here is that, do you expect a cooperation among fishermen? Yes or no? After conducting those experiments, we got 6 different results. Firstly, there is no indication of collaboration in this experiment. So there are different number of the fish caught among those experiments. Also, they found that high number of the fish caught in VCM experiment. And if you look at the table in the right side, you see the catch and effort. These are our measurements for the collaboration. And here we made t-test and Wilcoxon tests. And as you see, 5 PI and 5 VCM in each these 3 pairs rows. And here we basically compared 5 PI and 5 VCM in low, high, and SCR condition. And we concluded that there is no indication of the collaboration here. We had only 2 significant p-values. Also, we measured if there is any effort to make collaboration while catching the second fish. However, we got still a high p-value, which means that there is no collaboration here. And here we illustrated the average group catch. So as you see here, VCM lines are above the PI lines. So the 3 lines in the above are belongs to VCM experiment, and as you see, we got a higher number of the fish caught in those and lower in the PI. There is no change in the level of the cooperation over time. This is our second result. And if you look at the table in the left side, we have measured the level of the cooperation in early and late periods of the three types of the VCM experiment, and we did it for the catch and effort. And as you see under the p-value columns, we got high p-values. That shows that cooperation didn't change from early to late periods. And this is very consistent with the graph in the right side. As you see, as the period goes from 1 to 6, the effort, which is the average case per minute, didn't change, and this is true for both VCM and PI. We are now done with the field experiment. Let's talk about lab experiments. Here again we investigate collaboration. This time it is in the lab. To isolate the effect of subject pool from laboratory setting, they conducted three treatments. These are student lab, Fisher lab, and Fisher pond. For the lab experiment, people get pen and paper. They ask how many virtual fish they want to catch. For the student lab, they took that student from Tilburg University. For the Fisher lab, everything is same with the student lab, but participants were Davidsa Overs customers. And for the Fisher pond, same pool of the participants as Fisher lab, except that they are fishing at the pond. They decide how many virtual fish they want to catch, and this is very similar to field experiment that I explained in the VCM. So here we measure the cooperation as how many fish they decided to not to catch. So they did the similar experiment in field and lab. Do you think that here context affected the level of cooperation? So yes or no, and I would say the answer actually no. Evidence is from our student lab. Students collaborated in the early periods of the experiment and the level of cooperation decreased in the later periods. This means that lack of the cooperation in 5 VCM is not because of the context. And here we made the Wilcoxon test again, and this was for the student lab for the comparing between early catch and the late catch. So the cooperation decreased over time. That means that collaboration and context are not related. Next, we test whether the lack of cooperation in 5 VCM is due to difference in the subjects. It may be the case that fishermen are systematically less cooperative than students, and such difference accounts for the behavior we observed in the field treatment. So if we compare Stu lab and Fisher lab experiment, would you think that fishermen are more cooperative or not? The answer here is fishermen are more cooperative than the students in the lab. We will say here is that lack of the cooperation in 5 VCM is not due to recreational fishermen being less cooperative than students. It is also clear from the table here from the p-value between students and the fishermen. We also test if the fishermen are more cooperative in different periods, and we saw that the cooperation level didn't change during the time. And also, as a fifth result, we question whether the lab itself has an effect on the cooperation level that the fishermen showed. We do it by comparing the Fisher pond and the Fisher lab. And what we have found here is that cooperation decreased in the lab setting. It is clear also from the p-values in the results 5 table. Here we see the change in the level of the cooperation over time, not for the Fisher lab and Fisher pond, but for the student lab. Level of the cooperation decreased from period 1 to 6. Lastly, we question that if decision variable affects the level of cooperation, it may be that if reduction in fishing is required to achieve the cooperation, then individuals are less cooperative, or the benefit and the cost of the cooperation measured in different units like money versus fish, or the decision not to catch fish, these are different. For example, if individuals convince themselves that other players prefer to fish rather than money, then does that failure to reduce the one's own fishing is compatible with the social optimum? They test those effects and they found that no cooperation against those, and it didn't affect our result. Lastly, we look at the regression result. This is the ordered probit model. The dependent variable is number of the fish caught in a period. The model shows a clear and positive significant effect of our measure, which is effort, and this is cast mean here. The variable high and screening have a value of 1 when an observation is taken from those conditions, and they are significant as well. And QS are the location of the fishermen, and they are fixed effects. Also, the conditional effects in the last two lines are the position of the fisherman. We saw that position of the fisherman doesn't affect the result. Now Mariana will continue.
So for the conclusions part, we can say that the main conclusion is that the games do a poor job explaining both the self-report measures and the field behaviors, as they do not seem to explain to any significant extent any of the behaviors observed in the field. The results seem to support the conclusions in social preference games, according to which plain lab experiments has no predictive power for behavior in naturally occurring settings. The review and meta-analysis show that the typical study in this reports the results of comparing one lab game to one specific or several related field variables. Furthermore, there is a wide diversity in the type of variables, methods, and samples that were used. It is important to mention that the lack of a clear theoretical mapping of the context-free games into real-world situations, which allows for very different variables to be rationalized as potentially related to the games. Fishing streams, drinking beer, voting in school elections, etc. And this leads to uncertainty about the validity of the correlations in previous findings. As it was explained in the introduction, since there is a well-known bias in order to produce, submit, and publish significant results over insignificant ones, this can cause problems if the studies are not sufficiently systematic. Even if we exclude this fact, the systematic review and meta-analysis show that only 39.5% of the lab field correlations and 37.5% of the lab field regressions reported show significant associations, and this could probably mean that more systematic studies investigating the external validity of social preference games should take place. The experiments focused on one-shot games and didn't cover all existing social preference games or all the field situations, so the strategy could be extended by exploring repeated games, looking into other game structures, or creating other field situations. Apart from those, there are also other possibilities. For example, there could be a comparison between the patterns observed in reciprocal or altruistic or trusting or cooperative behavior in the lab, with patterns of reciprocal behavior occurring in different field environments. One potential limitation of this approach is that there is no clear theoretical mapping from one specific game to one specific field situation, as it was mentioned again above. However, such a mapping is virtually impossible to achieve with standard social preference games, because of their artificiality and lack of context, given that there could be no answer to the question of whether the games predict social behaviors that are relevant outside the lab. Another response could be that the issue of the external validity of social preference games doesn't matter so much. The authors of the paper seem to disagree with this specific claim as from their experience few experimental economists would feel comfortable with the idea that they are simply studying how people behave independently to the world outside of the lab. To conclude, there are two important points. First, through this research, no dispute is addressed about lab versus field experimentation. Second, the study is not dismissing the important contributions of the literature on social preferences. It is generally accepted that the social preference paradigm has provided groundbreaking insights into several phenomena like cooperation and punishment. However, there is an issue of whether the specific type of lab experimentation being conducted in this paradigm can capture the actual underpinnings of real-life social behavior, which may have to lead to a revision of some of the experimental methods used. On the other hand, personality measures can predict much better the average of various behaviors over time, so this could be interesting for further research in the future on the external validity of social preferences game. Regarding to cooperation among fishermen, the field and lab behavior also differ. We can analyze that furtherly at our conversation part about the two papers where we can look for similarities and differences, according to which the social preference games paper can make us finally wonder if we can predict real behavior through these games, which are one-shot games, and there is this important limitation that we mentioned about the clear theoretical mapping. And on the other hand, we have the cooperation among fishermen paper, which is based on cooperative behavior, and this is really important to overcome the tragedy of the commons, this situation where the users, the individuals share common resources, and this can make them be led to the risk of overuse of resources as they act independently. And we can see that in this paper, field experiment shows no cooperation in comparison with the lab. So we can discuss why this is happening and if nature or the real world makes a difference. And finally, how can we overcome the tragedy of the commons? We're looking forward to have a discussion with you. Thank you very much. For any questions, please feel free to ask.